In the gilded heart of Boston, where fortunes were counted in generations and secrets were sealed with a handshake, a young woman was about to challenge an empire with nothing more than a whisper of understanding. She saw an old woman, the silent matriarch of the city's most formidable dynasty, imprisoned in a fortress of flesh, invisible to all who looked at her. While others saw a tragedy, a living ghost, the waitress saw a mind burning brightly behind darkened windows. With a single quiet act of observation, she would decipher a code no one else knew existed, exposing a rot that ran to the very core of the family and igniting a love that was as unexpected as it was profound. What she did next wouldn't just change her table assignment, it would shatter a conspiracy and rewrite her destiny forever. The hushed reverence of Aurelia, perched atop the Prudential Tower, was not mere quiet. It was the sound of power. It was the whisper of billion-dollar deals, the silent glide of waiters over Persian silk, the clink of ice in $100 glasses of scotch. For Clara Mayhew, 26 and perpetually weary, this silence was the backdrop to a life lived on the margins of other people's extravagance. The crisp white uniform she wore was an armor, hiding the frayed cuffs of her reality. A third-floor walk-up in Somerville, a mountain of student debt from a degree she never finished, and the lingering, hollow ache of a grief that had defined her young life. Every perfectly plated dish she delivered, every polite smile she offered, was a means to an end. The patrons who spent more on an appetizer than she earned in a shift were abstract figures, their wealth as distant and untouchable as the stars outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tonight, however, the constellation of power had condensed at a single table. Table 12, the best in the house, was occupied by Alistair Sterling. At 38, Alistair was less a man and more a Boston institution. He was the inheritor and aggressive architect of Sterling Industries, a global logistics empire founded by his great-grandfather. With a jaw that looked carved from New England granite and eyes the color of a winter storm on the Atlantic, he radiated an aura of impatient authority. He rarely dined out, and when he did, it was with purpose. Tonight, his companions were two sleek, silver-haired lawyers and his mother, Genevieve Sterling. Genevieve was a portrait of Brahmin elegance, her silver hair coiled in a perfect chignon, a triple strand of heirloom pearls at her throat. Yet for all her poised beauty, she was utterly still. A catastrophic stroke 5 years prior had left her with locked-in syndrome, a cruel prison where a perfectly lucid mind is trapped inside a body that cannot move or speak. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were the only part of her that could move freely, darting from the window to the faces at her table, a silent observer of her own life. The restaurant's manager, Monsieur Dubois, a man whose deference was a finely tuned art form, supervised the table personally. "Mr. Sterling, your usual Chateaubriand?" he murmured. Alistair nodded, his attention fixed on a tablet displaying stock tickers. "And for my mother," he said, his voice dropping, the command softening into a familiar, weary routine. "The pureed asparagus soup, no croutons. Ensure it's lukewarm." Dubois then turned to Genevieve, his professional smile becoming painfully bright and slow. He leaned in close, speaking loudly as if the volume could bridge the neurological chasm. "Mrs. Sterling, I hope you are enjoying the view." Genevieve's eyes didn't even flicker towards him. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyelids was the only sign of her reaction. It was a micro-expression Clara recognized with a stab to her heart. It wasn't deafness Dubois was dealing with. It was total paralysis. And his loud, simplistic address was an insult to the intelligence he couldn't see. It was the sting of being treated like an object, a piece of furniture to be addressed but not heard. Alistair's jaw hardened. "She can hear you perfectly fine, Dubois. She just can't answer. Bring the soup." The words were clipped, cold steel. This was the part he hated, the public spectacle of his mother's condition, the well-meaning but ignorant gestures that only underscored her profound isolation. He had poured millions into cutting-edge technology, experimental therapies, and the world's best neurologists. He could buy a company, a fleet of jets, an island. But he could not buy his mother a single word. From her station by the service bar, Clara watched, and the polished dining room of Aurelia dissolved. She was 16 again, in the dim, lavender-scented bedroom of her grandmother's house. She saw Grandma Helen felled by the same cruel thief, a stroke that had stolen her voice and body, but left her brilliant, witty mind intact. Clara had spent 5 years by that bedside, learning a language that had no name, a language of blinks, one for yes, two for no, a language of slight nostril flares that meant frustration, and most importantly, a language of fingers. Helen had retained the faintest flicker of movement in her left index finger, and together they had devised a system. A tap for A, two for B, a long pause to reset. It was slow, arduous, but it was their lifeline. It was how Helen told her stories, shared her fears, and said, "I love you," until the very end. Clara saw that same fierce intelligence flickering in Genevieve Sterling's eyes. She saw the ghost of a vibrant person desperate to be seen. Dubois scurried away. The lawyers at the table, after a moment of awkward silence, resumed their discussion of maritime law. Alistair reached over and adjusted his mother's shawl. He pulled out his phone and typed a message, holding it up for her to read. "Are you comfortable?" She blinked once. Yes. The interaction was sterile, functional. The connection was a thread, thin and taut, where it should have been a tapestry. An impulse, wild and unprofessional, surged through Clara. Dubois' cardinal rule was unwritten but absolute. Do not engage with the clientele unless summoned, especially not the Sterlings. To break this rule was to invite immediate, unceremonious dismissal. But the image of Genevieve's intelligent eyes, so much like her grandmother's, staring out from her silent prison, it was a call to action she couldn't ignore. This was a professional gamble, but a human imperative. She took a steadying breath, smoothed her apron, and began the long walk across the marble floor. The atmosphere around table 12 was a palpable force field of wealth and influence. As she approached, the lawyer's conversation faltered. Dubois, catching the movement from across the room, stopped dead, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Alistair Sterling looked up, his stormy eyes locking on to her. The annoyance in his gaze was a physical thing. "We don't need anything," he said, his voice a low growl meant to dismiss a fly. Clara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her focus was absolute. She did not look at him. Her eyes were only for the silent woman in the wheelchair. She gave a small, respectful nod. "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice soft and clear. Then she did something that stopped the world on its axis. She leaned in slightly, her gaze fixed on Genevieve's left hand, which lay motionless on the velvet armrest. On the tip of the index finger, she saw it. A tremor, a microscopic twitch, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It was the opening she had prayed for. Keeping her voice low and calm, directed only at Genevieve, she said, "My grandmother used to love the view from up high. She said it made her feel like the whole world was telling her its secrets." She paused. "If you would like to tell me one of yours, Mrs. Sterling, I know how to listen. Just tell me when you're ready." The two lawyers exchanged bewildered glances. Alistair's expression had shifted from annoyance to a dangerous, simmering anger. He opened his mouth to have her thrown out, but before he could utter a sound, it happened. A single, deliberate twitch from Genevieve's index finger, then another, and another, slow, faint, but unmistakable. Clara watched, her concentration absolute, her lips moving silently as she translated the painstaking code. THANKYOU. Alistair Sterling stared, his face a canvas of raw, unfiltered shock. The lawyers were speechless, their mouths agape. For 5 years, the best minds in medicine had told him that any voluntary movement was impossible. They had scanned his mother's brain, run every test imaginable, and concluded that the neural pathways were irrevocably severed. Yet this waitress, in a standard-issue uniform, had just elicited a response. Not just a response, a conversation. The most profound reaction, however, came from Genevieve. As Clara finished decoding the words, a single tear escaped from the corner of her right eye and traced a silent path down her powdered cheek. Her eyes, which had been so distant, were now locked on Clara's, blazing with a light that had been extinguished for half a decade. It was the light of being seen. In that moment, with a simple act of focused attention, The quiet waitress from Somerville had detonated a bomb in the center of Alistair Sterling's carefully controlled world. She hadn't made a sound. She had simply listened to the silence, and it had answered her. The charged stillness at table 12 was absolute. The ambient symphony of Aurelia, the clinking glasses, the hushed conversations, faded into a distant hum. For Alistair Sterling, the scene before him was a logical impossibility. He had invested a sum that could fund a small nation's GDP into finding a key to his mother's prison. He had employed teams of neurologists, engineers, and therapists. They had brought advanced brain-computer interfaces, retinal scanners, and experimental drugs, all of which had failed. And now a waitress, whose name he didn't know, had achieved what his millions could not, using nothing but her eyes and a quiet patience that felt both miraculous and accusatory. Clara, intensely aware of the stunned silence, remained focused on Genevieve. She felt an immediate, powerful kinship with the older woman, an understanding forged in the shared crucible of silent communication. She smiled gently. "You're very welcome," she said softly, then watched the finger again. The twitches were stronger now, more insistent. MYHUSBANDKNEW. Clara's heart ached. Her grandmother had told her the same thing, that her husband, gone for years, was the only one who truly knew the language of her heart. ALISTAIRTRIES BUTHEDOESNOTSEE. Alistair watched this silent exchange, a maelstrom of emotions warring behind his stoic facade. There was astonishment, yes, but also a deep, shameful guilt. He had been trying to manage his mother's condition, to provide for her comfort, to protect her. He had been so focused on finding a technological or medical solution that he had failed to look for the human one. He had been trying to fix a machine, not communicate with a person. He saw his mother's face, animated by that single tear, more alive and present than he had seen her in years. Finally, he found his voice, the granite edge softened by a tremor of disbelief. "How?" he asked, the word raspy, directed at Clara. "How are you doing that?" Clara at last turned to him, her professional decorum returning like a shield, though her pulse was still a wild drumbeat. "My grandmother, sir, she had a similar condition after her stroke. We developed a system. It's about looking for the small signs, the ones everyone else misses." Monsieur Dubois was now hovering nearby, wringing his hands, his face ashen. He was certain this bizarre, unprecedented interaction would cost him his most prized patron. He opened his mouth to apologize, to drag Clara away, but Alistair cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Leave her," he commanded, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. He then turned to his stunned associates. "Gentlemen, our dinner is concluded. My driver will see you to your destinations. We'll reconvene on the maritime case tomorrow." It was an unequivocal dismissal. The lawyers, sensing the tectonic shift that had occurred, gathered their briefcases and departed with a series of bewildered nods. The vast table, moments before a theater of corporate power, now held only 3 people: the billionaire, his silent mother, and the waitress. "Please," Alistair said, his voice softer than Clara had ever imagined it could be. He gestured to one of the now empty plush chairs. "Sit." "Sir, I can't. I'm on duty," Clara stammered, acutely aware of Dubois' horrified gape from across the room. "You're not," Alistair stated, a note of finality in his tone. "As of this moment, you are my mother's guest." He looked over at the terrified manager. "Dubois, add a $2,000 tip to my bill for every member of the staff tonight, and send a bottle of the 82 Petrus to our table. For Miss—" He looked at Clara expectantly. "Mayhew," she supplied, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara Mayhew." "Ain't for Miss Mayhew." Dubois, shocked into obedience by the sheer scale of the command, simply nodded dumbly and fled to the cellar. Overwhelmed, Clara slowly sank into the velvet chair. It felt like she had crossed an invisible boundary into another universe. Genevieve's eyes shone, her entire being suffused with a joy so palpable it was almost a physical warmth in the air. The next hour was surreal. The magnificent bottle of wine remained mostly untouched as a conversation, unlike any other Aurelia had ever witnessed, unfolded. Clara became the bridge, the conduit between a mother and son who were, in many ways, speaking for the first time in 5 years. Through Clara's patient translation, Genevieve unleashed a torrent of thoughts, observations, and frustrations that had been trapped for half a decade. She commented on the new wing of the Museum of Fine Arts. Gaudy. She asked about her grandnephews. Is Richard still dating that dreadful woman? She expressed her profound hatred for the color beige, the color Alistair's chosen interior decorator had used to swathe her entire private wing of the mansion. It is the color of surrender. Alistair listened, mesmerized. He learned that his mother, who he thought was placidly content, was in fact bored, opinionated, and fiercely witty. Her mind, the mind of a Vassar-educated cryptographer who had done contract work for the NSA in her youth, was as sharp and intricate as ever. He also found himself watching Clara. He noted the way her brow furrowed in intense concentration, the small, reassuring smiles she gave his mother, the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her. She wasn't awed by his wealth or intimidated by his power. In this singular context, she was the one in control. She held the key. As the evening wound down, Alistair knew a large check or a simple thank you would be a profound insult to what had transpired. This was not a service. It was a resurrection. An idea, audacious and unconventional, began to form in his mind. Miss Mayhew, he said, leaning forward, his voice imbued with a new gravity. I have a proposition for you. It is unusual, and it would require you to leave your position here. Clara's breath caught. She thought of the overdue rent, the looming student loan payments, the constant, grinding anxiety of her finances. What kind of proposition, Mr. Sterling? My mother's care is managed by a team of the best nurses in the country. They are medically brilliant, but they cannot do what you just did. I want to hire you, not as a nurse, but as a communicator, a companion, to be her voice, to engage her mind. He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. I will pay you $250,000 for 1 year. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. The number was astronomical, incomprehensible. It was a figure from another reality. It was not just a lifeline. It was a new life. Before she could process the number, she looked at Genevieve. The old woman's eyes were fixed on her, pleading, desperate, filled with a hope so raw it was painful to witness. Her finger began its slow, deliberate dance. Please. Looking at that silent plea, thinking of the brilliant mind trapped behind those eyes, and the freedom such a sum would grant her from her own financial prison, Clara knew there was only one possible answer. Her carefully ordered, predictable world of struggle had just been upended. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. Yes, I accept. The following Monday morning, Clara's life underwent a seismic shift. A gleaming black Bentley, a quiet sentinel of unimaginable wealth, was waiting for her outside her worn-out Somerville apartment building. The driver, a discreet man named Thomas, addressed her as Miss Mayhew and held the door as if she were royalty. Her neighbors watched from their windows, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Their destination was the Sterling estate in Chestnut Hill, a sprawling stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a university campus, hidden from the road by a formidable iron gate and a small forest of ancient oaks. As Clara stepped into the grand two-story foyer, she was met by a world of polished mahogany, intricate parquet floors, and ancestral portraits whose stern eyes seemed to judge her worn coat and scuffed leather boots. A woman with a ramrod-straight posture and silver hair pulled into a severe chignon introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the household manager. Her inspection of Clara was swift, thorough, and silently critical. Mr. Sterling is in his study. Mrs. Sterling is in the solarium. You are to begin immediately, she stated, her tone as crisp and starched as her uniform. Clara was led not to Alistair, but to Genevieve. She found her in a glass-walled room overflowing with orchids, a cashmere blanket draped over her lap. When Genevieve saw her, her eyes lit up with a pure, unadulterated joy that instantly dispelled the mansion's chilly, museum-like atmosphere. Youcame, her finger tapped against a newly installed, pressure-sensitive pad on her armrest. which translated the taps into letters on a small screen. Alistair had already begun to innovate. "I'm here," Clara said, her smile genuine, "and I'm not going anywhere." Their days quickly fell into a rhythm. Clara read to Genevieve, not vapid magazines but dense historical biographies and articles from The Economist, which Genevieve would comment on with her dry, tapping wit. They worked their way through the Criterion collection, with Genevieve offering scathing critiques of Hitchcock's later work. Clara, acting as her hands, began reorganizing Genevieve's extensive library, which had been left untouched for 5 years. Through this process, Clara began to piece together a portrait of the woman Genevieve had been. A brilliant, formidable intellectual with a passion for codes, patterns, and forgotten histories. Alistair remained a distant, though constant, presence. He was initially wary, observing Clara with a hawk-like intensity. He treated the arrangement like a scientific experiment, demanding detailed daily reports on his mother's cognitive engagement levels. He was a man who trusted data, not miracles. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't deny the evidence before him. His mother was transformed. The vacant, resigned look she so often wore was gone, replaced by a constant, alert engagement. The hollow silence of the mansion was now filled with the sound of Clara's voice, reading, laughing, and translating. Not everyone in the Sterling orbit viewed Clara's arrival as a positive development. Edward Sterling, Alistair's younger cousin, was a frequent visitor. He was a man who moved with the predatory grace of a panther, his smile charming and his eyes holding the cold glint of a calculating mind. Edward managed the family's philanthropic arm, the Franklin Sterling Literacy Trust, a charity established in honor of Genevieve's late husband. He found Clara and Genevieve in the library one afternoon, a large ledger book open between them. He bestowed a breezy kiss on his aunt's cheek before turning his assessing gaze on Clara. "So you're the miracle worker," he said, his voice a smooth purr. "Alistair is quite taken with your talents." "I'm just happy to be of help to your aunt," Clara replied evenly, refusing to be baited. "Of course," Edward said, his smile never quite touching his eyes. "It's quite the Cinderella story. A girl from Somerville, plucked from obscurity. You must be thrilled." The implication was clear. She was an outsider, a charity case, a temporary curiosity. He made it a point to interrupt their sessions, to question Clara's interpretations, to suggest that perhaps she was projecting her own thoughts onto his aunt. He saw the burgeoning alliance between the two women, the genuine affection and intellectual respect, and it unnerved him. For 5 years, Genevieve had been a silent, compliant figurehead, her signature a rubber stamp he could apply to any document he pleased. A reawakened Genevieve, with a direct and articulate line to the outside world, was a complication he had not foreseen. One evening, Edward found Alistair in his study. "She's certainly charming," he began, pouring himself a generous measure of Alistair's best single malt. "Clara is professional and highly effective," Alistair corrected, his eyes on a spreadsheet. "Oh, no doubt," Edward purred, swirling the amber liquid. "But don't you find it all a bit convenient? This girl, with this one incredibly specific, unprovable skill, just happens to be waiting tables where you dine. We know nothing about her, Alistair, her background, her debts. What if this is a long con? A woman that perceptive could have easily researched your mother's condition." "She was a caregiver for her grandmother," Alistair stated, his voice tight. "I had her vetted." "A background check shows facts, not intent," Edward countered, leaning against the mahogany desk. "A good sob story is the oldest grift in the book. I'm just saying, be careful. You've given this complete stranger unprecedented access to Mother, to our family. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment." Alistair's gaze remained on his screen. "My mother is happy," he said, the words a stone wall. "That is the only data point that matters." But after Edward left, the poison of his words began to seep into Alistair's thoughts. He was a man who had built an empire by anticipating risk and mitigating threats. He trusted no one implicitly. He had made this decision based on a gut feeling, an emotional reaction in a restaurant, an anomaly in his ruthlessly logical life. Was Edward right? Was Clara Mayhew's timely appearance too good to be true? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it took root, a dark weed in the well-tended garden of his certainty. He had let a stranger into the heart of his fortress. Now he had to wonder if she was there to help or to plunder. The weeks leading up to the annual Sterling Foundation Gala became a period of strange duality for Clara. By day, she was immersed in Genevieve's world, a world of intellectual rigor and quiet camaraderie that she found deeply fulfilling. They had a project. Genevieve, a former cryptographer, wanted to review the financial records of the Franklin Sterling Literacy Trust, the charity managed by Edward. She found the work of analyzing spreadsheets and donation receipts invigorating, a puzzle to be solved. Clara, acting as her eyes and hands, spent hours poring over dense financial statements. It was during one of these sessions that Genevieve first flagged an anomaly. ASKEDWARDWHY-THEVERHERFINGER-tapped Her finger tapped. INDUSTRYSTANDARDISFIFTEEN. When Clara relayed the question to Edward at their next meeting, his charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Ah, a necessary adjustment," he'd said smoothly. "We had to hire specialist consultants for community outreach. Very pricey, but worth it for the results." The answer was plausible, but the fleeting look of panic in his eyes was a note of discord Clara didn't forget. Genevieve, too, was unconvinced, tapping out a single, sharp word, LIE. Alistair, meanwhile, was wrestling with the seeds of doubt Edward had planted. He found himself manufacturing reasons to work from the mansion, his study door left ajar, listening to the cadence of Clara's voice as she read to his mother. The profound positive change in Genevieve was undeniable. She was no longer a passive recipient of care. She was an active participant in her own life, and it was all because of Clara. His logical mind told him the results were what mattered. But the cynical, suspicious part of him, the part forged in hostile takeovers and corporate espionage, kept replaying Edward's warnings. He began to test her in subtle ways. He'd leave a financial report containing a deliberate error on the table, only to have Clara point it out an hour later, explaining that Genevieve had spotted it. He'd ask her opinion on a complex market analysis, and she would defer, saying, "Let me ask Mrs. Sterling. Her mind for patterns is far sharper than mine." She never overstepped. She never claimed credit. Her loyalty was always to Genevieve. Still, the doubt lingered. One afternoon, he found her in the music room, a cavernous space that had been silent for years. She was seated at the Bösendorfer grand piano, her fingers moving hesitantly over the keys, playing a simple, melancholic Chopin nocturne. She didn't hear him enter. The music was soft, filled with a quiet longing that seemed to echo the room's own dusty memories. "I didn't know you played," he said, his voice startling her. She snatched her hands away from the keys as if they were burned. "I don't. Not really. My grandmother taught me a little." "It sounded more than a little," he said, moving closer. He was genuinely impressed. The tune was simple, but her touch was expressive, imbued with a deep, unfeigned emotion. "What else are you hiding, Miss Mayhew?" The question was light, but the undercurrent of suspicion was there. Clara felt it like a change in barometric pressure. "Nothing, Mr. Sterling. I'm exactly who I appear to be." Her gaze was direct, unwavering, and for a moment it disarmed him. He was seeing the layers of her, the caregiver, the intellectual partner, the quiet musician. He was also seeing the woman, the way the afternoon light caught the auburn strands in her hair, the intelligence in her clear, gray eyes. He felt a pull, a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with her. This complicated things. An emotional entanglement was a variable he could not control. "The Foundation Gala is next Friday," he said, his tone abruptly shifting back to business. "It is my mother's most important public appearance of the year. I expect you to be by her side." "Of course," she said. "You'll need a dress," he continued as if discussing a logistical problem. "And jewelry. My assistant will arrange for couturier to come to the house, and a selection from Cartier." The mention of Cartier made Clara flinch. "Mr. Sterling, that is far too extravagant. It's not necessary." "Nonsense," he said coolly. "You are representing the Sterling family. You will look the part." It wasn't an offer, it was a decree. The warmth of the moment in the music room was gone, replaced by the cold reality of their arrangement. She was an employee, an asset to be managed and presented. The day before the gala, a private investigator hired by Edward delivered a dossier to his office. It was a meticulously compiled portrait of Clara's life, her parents' acrimonious divorce, her father's subsequent failed business ventures that had left him bankrupt and broken, the mountain of debt she had absorbed after his death to ensure her mother didn't lose her home, the second and third mortgages. Edward smiled. He didn't see a story of filial duty and sacrifice. He saw a weapon. To a pragmatist like Alistair, this wasn't resilience. It was a five-alarm fire of desperation. A woman this deep in financial trouble would do anything to secure her position. It was the perfect narrative to frame her as a master manipulator. He picked up the phone and dialed his cousin's private line. "Alistair," he said, his voice a carefully calibrated instrument of grave concern, "I have something you need to see. It's about Clara Mayhew, and it's worse than I thought." The Sterling Foundation Gala was held at the Boston Public Library, the historic courtyard transformed into a shimmering fantasy of white roses and celestial lights. It was the apex of the city's social calendar, a gathering of old money and new power. The theme, fittingly, was Giving Voice, a tribute to the literacy programs the foundation supported. Clara felt like an actress on a foreign stage. The gown, a deep sapphire silk by Carolina Herrera, felt like a borrowed skin. The necklace Alistair had insisted she wear, a cascade of diamonds that felt cold and heavy against her throat, was a beautiful manacle, marking her as part of the Sterling entourage. But beside her, Genevieve Sterling was radiant. It was her first major public event since her stroke, and with Clara as her discreet, seamless interpreter, she was not a passive object of pity, but the commanding queen of the evening. She held court from her tastefully appointed wheelchair, engaging in a tapped-out, translated debate with the governor about tax policy, sharing a witty observation with a Pulitzer-winning author, and offering sharp, insightful comments on the foundation's direction. The city's elite, who had for years offered Genevieve nothing more than condescending pats on the hand, were now witnessing the full, undiminished force of her intellect. Alistair watched them from across the room, a glass of Macallan 25 untouched in his hand. Edward's dossier lay like a lead weight in his mind. He'd read the damning report, the stark figures of Clara's debt, the narrative of financial desperation. Every word seemed to confirm Edward's poisonous theory. "She's playing you, Alistair. She needs this, and a woman who needs something that badly is capable of anything." Yet as he watched her now, he saw no trace of the cunning gold digger Edward described. He saw her lean in to catch a faint tap from his mother, her expression one of utter concentration. He saw the genuine warmth in her smile as she translated a joke for the mayor. He saw the fierce, protective energy she radiated, a guardian at the gate of his mother's silence. His logic and his instinct were locked in a brutal, irreconcilable war. He finally made his way through the throng, his public mask of cool composure perfectly in place. "Mother, you are holding the entire room captive," he said, kissing her cheek. Genevieve's eyes twinkled as her finger tapped on the pad. "Tell him it's because I finally have a competent translator," Clara relayed, a small smile playing on her lips. Clara looked up at Alistair, and for a brief, unguarded moment, their eyes met. She saw a flicker of the man from the music room, a flash of warmth and admiration, but it was immediately shuttered, replaced by a cold, impenetrable distance. Something had changed. Something was terribly wrong. The evening's main event was a presentation by Edward on the Foundation's latest initiative. He took the stage, slick and confident, a slideshow of smiling children projected behind him. He spoke of their new flagship program, a partnership with a tech firm to develop a revolutionary brain-computer interface, a BCI, designed for nonverbal patients. "And tonight," Edward announced with a flourish, "we have a very special demonstration. We are going to attempt to give a voice back to the very woman who inspired this foundation, my dear Aunt Genevieve Sterling." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Clara felt a jolt of ice in her veins. This was the first she'd heard of it. She looked at Alistair, whose face was a thundercloud. He clearly hadn't known either. This was Edward's show. Two technicians in lab coats appeared, wheeling a complex-looking apparatus of wires and monitors. They gently placed a sleek, silver headset on Genevieve's head. This device, Edward explained, reads subtle neural signals and, through a complex algorithm, translates them into speech. It is the future. The trap was set. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Edward planned to publicly discredit Clara by demonstrating that technology, real science, could not reach his aunt, thereby proving that Clara's communications must be a fraudulent performance. "Let's begin," Edward said, his voice dripping with feigned excitement. "Aunt Genevieve, can you hear us? Can you say hello?" The room held its breath. A low hum came from the machine, and then a distorted synthetic voice crackled from the speakers. Fuzzy, static, mountain, blue. It was meaningless, horrifying gibberish. The technicians frantically checked their monitors. Edward's face was a mask of rehearsed disappointment. "It seems the technology is not quite there yet," he said, his voice laced with sorrow. "My aunt's condition is perhaps more profound than we had dared to hope." He looked out into the crowd, his gaze landing directly on Clara, a look of pity that was sharper than any accusation. "It shows how much we can project our own hopes, our own desires for communication, onto a loved one." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara was a fraud, a purveyor of false hope. The crowd was shifting, whispering. Alistair stood frozen, the dossier in his mind screaming, "I told you so," while his heart rebelled. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, dismissing her. The humiliation was a physical blow, stealing her breath. She looked at Genevieve, expecting to see defeat. Instead, she saw fire. Genevieve's eyes were locked on her nephew, blazing with a cold, pure rage. And her left index finger, hidden from the audience's view by the armrest, was tapping. It wasn't the slow, letter-by-letter code they usually used. It was frantic, insistent, a pattern of short and long taps. ... dash, 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 ... Clara's mind raced back to the library, to the books on cryptography. Genevieve had once tapped out that her husband, a wartime radio operator, had taught her Morse code as a game when they were courting. Clara had filed it away as a piece of personal history. Now she understood. It was an emergency channel. SOS. Clara's paralysis shattered. Her fear was replaced by a cold, clear purpose. She walked from her position at the side of the room directly to the stage, taking the secondary microphone from the stand. The room fell into a sudden, shocked silence. "The device isn't working," Clara said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "Because you're not asking the right questions." She turned not to Genevieve's face, but to the screen displaying the BCI's raw data feed. It was a chaotic jumble of waveforms. "And you're listening to the wrong language." She ignored the machine. She ignored Edward's furious glower. She looked only at Genevieve's eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," she said clearly, "my grandmother told me that the loudest lies are often told in the quietest rooms. Is your nephew, Edward Sterling, a liar?" Genevieve's eyes blinked once, sharp and definite. "Yes." The crowd gasped. "Is he lying about the Franklin Sterling Literacy Trust?" One blink. "Yes." Edward stepped forward. "This is absurd. She's leading the witness. This is a circus." Clara held up a hand. "I'm not finished." She looked back at Genevieve. The finger on the armrest was tapping again, slowly this time, with painstaking precision. Clara read it aloud as it came. CAYMAN, ACCOUNTS, FRANKLINS, LEGACY, STOLEN. The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a deep well. Cayman accounts. Franklin's legacy. Stolen. It was a complete, devastating accusation. Edward's face had gone from red to a ghastly, bloodless white. All his charm, all his polish had vanished, leaving only the raw panic of a cornered thief. Alistair, who had been watching the scene unfold as if in a trance, finally moved. The war in his head was over. His instinct had won. He strode onto the stage, his face a mask of glacial fury. He didn't even look at his cousin. His stormy eyes were fixed on Clara, and in them she saw a universe of regret and dawning, horrified understanding. He took the microphone from her hand. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. The gala is over. Security, please escort my cousin to my study and do not let him leave. He then turned to the stunned, silent audience. My apologies. It appears the theme of tonight's gala, giving voice, has been more successful than any of us could have possibly imagined. The immediate aftermath was a blur of discreet security guards, canceled caterers, and the hurried, whispering departure of Boston's elite. Clara escorted a visibly drained but triumphant Genevieve back to the mansion, the silence in the Bentley thick with unspoken emotions. Once her charge was settled for the night, comforted by a nurse, Clara stood alone in the grand foyer, the borrowed diamonds feeling like shards of glass against her skin. She felt no victory, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The front door opened and Alistair entered. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and tie, and he looked older, the weight of the night's revelations etched onto his face. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stood there, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. "My office," he finally said, his voice hoarse. The atmosphere in the mahogany-paneled room was heavy with contrition. The damning dossier Edward had given him was on the desk, looking flimsy and sordid. Alistair didn't sit. He paced the room, the caged energy of a man whose world had been upended radiating from him. "He's confessed to everything," Alistair began, his voice low. "For 7 years he's been embezzling funds from the trust, millions, funneling them through shell corporations into offshore accounts. The consulting fees my mother flagged. That was the beginning of the thread. She knew. Her mind is as sharp as it ever was, and he knew it. He had to keep her silent, isolated. He saw you as a threat from the moment you walked in." He stopped pacing and faced her. "He weaponized my own worst tendencies against me, my cynicism, my suspicion. He gave me a logical reason to doubt a miracle, and I took it because it was easier than believing I had been wrong about everything." His gaze was raw, stripped of all artifice. "I read that file," he said, gesturing to the dossier. "I saw your debts, your struggles, and I used them to build a narrative that fit my worldview. I believed you were a grifter because the alternative, that a person of your character and integrity could be in such a precarious position, was an indictment of the world I live in." He stepped closer, his stormy eyes pleading. "The things I thought, the things I suspected. I accused you in my heart, Clara. That is an unforgivable insult. 'I'm sorry' is a pathetic, inadequate phrase for the magnitude of my failure." Clara listened, her own anger and hurt slowly being replaced by a weary understanding. He wasn't making excuses. He was dissecting his own character flaws with the same ruthless precision he applied to a corporate balance sheet. With trembling fingers, she reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace. She walked to his desk and laid it gently on the polished wood. "I am not for sale, Mr. Sterling, and my help is not a commodity to be purchased." "I know," he said softly. "I know that now." She turned to leave, her role in this family drama seemingly complete. "My resignation is effective immediately," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll pack my things." "Don't," he said, the word a command but the tone a plea. "Don't go. Please." She paused at the door, her back to him. "This isn't about the money," he continued, his voice strained. "This is about my mother. You have given her back her world, and it's about the foundation. Edward's corruption has poisoned my father's legacy. I have to rebuild it, and I cannot do it alone. I need someone with integrity, someone who understands the mission not as a line item, but as a human imperative. I need someone who knows how to listen." Clara slowly turned around. The exhaustion was still there, but so was a flicker of something else, a sense of unfinished business. "It's not a job I'm offering you, Clara," he said, taking another step closer. "It's a partnership. I want you to run the Sterling Foundation, not as a consultant, not as an employee, as its executive director, with full autonomy and a mandate to find the people who are truly voiceless and give them the resources they need." She stared at him, stunned. It was an audacious, unthinkable offer. He was handing her the keys to a kingdom, not as a reward, but as an act of profound trust. an atonement. Why? She whispered. Because, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You were the only one in a room full of powerful people who saw the person everyone else overlooked. You don't just see the problems, you see the people inside them. I spent a fortune trying to fix my mother. You fixed our family just by paying attention. The resolution was not instantaneous. Trust, once so thoroughly broken, had to be rebuilt brick by brick. Clara did not accept the position immediately. Instead, she laid out her terms. First, a full independent audit of the entire Sterling philanthropic portfolio. Second, the establishment of a new board for the foundation, comprised not of Alistair's corporate allies, but of community leaders, ethicists, and experts in the fields they aim to serve. Alistair agreed to every condition without hesitation. In the months that followed, a quiet transformation took place. Edward Sterling was quietly but completely excised from the family, facing legal repercussions that were handled with brutal, private efficiency. The foundation was dismantled and reborn as the Genevieve and Franklin Sterling Center for Communication and Advocacy. Clara, as its new director, moved from a small desk in the mansion to a corner office overlooking the Boston Common, but her approach never changed. She spent most of her time not in boardrooms, but in underfunded schools, community clinics, and research labs, listening. Alistair, for his part, began his own education. He started taking night classes at a local college, not in business, but in neurology and speech pathology. He spent hours with Genevieve's therapists, learning not just to manage her care, but to participate in it. He learned to read the subtle cues of her facial muscles, to understand the rhythm of her blinks. The frantic tapping of Morse code was no longer needed. He was finally learning to see. Their relationship evolved slowly, cautiously. It was forged in late-night strategy sessions over blueprints for a new assistive technology lab and debates over grant proposals. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer his employee. She was his equal, a respected colleague whose judgment he trusted implicitly. The warmth he'd felt in the music room returned, no longer a dangerous complication, but a quiet, steady flame. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the infamous gala, Alistair found Clara on the rooftop garden of the new center, a space she'd had designed for staff and beneficiaries. She was sitting with Genevieve, who was using a new custom-built eye-tracking device to type on a screen, her words appearing in a fluid, steady stream. They were laughing. Alistair stood back, watching them, a small, genuine smile on his face. He approached and handed Clara a small, leather-bound book. It was an antique first edition of a book on cryptography, one she had mentioned Genevieve had been trying to find for years. "A thank you is not enough," he said softly, echoing his words from so long ago. But this time they were imbued with a new meaning. "But it's a start." Clara took the book, her fingers brushing his. The brief touch was an electric current of everything that had passed between them: suspicion, betrayal, forgiveness, and a deep, abiding respect. She looked at him, her gray eyes clear and bright. "It's a very good start," she said. In the end, Clara's story was not a fairy tale. It was not about a poor girl being rescued by a rich prince. It was about a woman whose quiet power, the power of empathy, observation, and unwavering integrity, exposed a corrupt system and healed a broken family. She didn't just find a voice for a silent matriarch. She taught an entire dynasty a new language, one where listening was more powerful than speaking, and understanding was the most valuable currency of all.